Janine, welcome to the podcast and thank you for making the time to chat with me today.
Oh, Elena, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that we're here.
Yes, absolutely. It's a long time coming, and I'm really excited to kind of share with the audience your experience with high performance teams, your wonderful podcast, which I think is so relevant in terms of topics that you cover. But my first question to my guest is always just give us a little snapshot, a little context to who you are and your career story.
So, my career story is probably a lot like many people's career story. So, I had a plan, and then very quickly I realized that was not what I wanted to do. And so, I grew up in a family where my parents made it very clear neither one of them had come from any money at all. And my dad ended up being a successful architect, and I'm the first kid. And so, they made it really clear that, as my dad was creating, you know, not a bunch of money, but some measure of wealth, that there are obligations that come with that, and that I was being well educated, and that happened to be born in the United States and happened to be born white. All of that meant that I had privilege. Um, and so all of that ended up meaning that I needed to give back. And they made it very clear I could make that manifest in my life however I wanted, but their request was
Mhm.
that I take it seriously. And so my first plan was to be an attorney. I realized that was, in fact, not what I wanted to do. And so I ended up spending the first almost 20 years of my life working for nonprofit organizations and did a lot of sort of helping organizations move through change. I did a lot of training. And then in 2008, when the economy got bad again, I thought, I'm not sure if I want to keep doing this. And so I ended up pivoting again and going to work for a Fortune 200 company. And was there for almost another 10 years. And part of what was so interesting to me was how all the stuff that was happening among the people in the little nonprofit organizations were the same things that were happening among the people in the Fortune 200 companies, both the good things that were happening and the dysfunctional things that were
Mhm.
happening. And so in 2017, I decided to open my own business, which is called the J&J Consulting Group. And what we do is we work inside of organizations to help deal with those dysfunctions among humans. So whether it's communication or whether it's, almost always it comes down to some level of communication.
Mhm.
And it may be something around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It may be something around um, training leaders, because I'm going to change that actually to training managers, because most managers have never been trained in how to manage. And so there's a lot of mischief that can happen at that level. And so got really interested in that whole world, got trained in emotional intelligence. And so then the podcast that you mentioned, The Cost of Not Paying Attention, is a outgrowth of that, because I've realized
Mhm.
that my mission is to have the world of work be one in which everyone can thrive.
Mhm.
And while the nonprofit organizations were all about, creating do-gooding in the world, my role in those nonprofit organizations was really always around empowering people. And I realized, like, for me, that's the through line. And so obviously that's a what's called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And there's no way I'm going to achieve that in my lifetime. But to get as close as possible, I want to reach as many people as possible through all of the ways that I can. So I so appreciate being a guest here on your podcast. And so that's the non-linear road that has taken me to where I am today.
No, it's a very Hey you, thanks for watching. If you're enjoying this episode, make sure to share it with friends and family who might find it interesting. Make sure to hit the subscribe button as well to stay up to date on weekly new videos that are going to be coming out with some awesome guests that I bring on. And if you have any questions, use the comment section to ask me questions, to interact. I look forward to talking to you. No, I very much appreciate your story and thank you for sharing. You know what I
You're
find
welcome.
interesting is that, first of all, I'm really glad that people like yourself who are kind of trying to make a change, particularly when it comes to teams and communication. What's astonishing to me is that this is number one issue that we hear over and over again in terms of communication. And we're not going to go into the individual part, maybe that's a whole other podcast, but the communication piece in teams and
Yep.
also the managers. So I think statistically, like managers spend 10 years in a managerial role without, like 85% of them don't get management training, but they've been in
Yeah.
that role for 10 years. And why do you
Right.
think we just keep doing the same mistake? Like, because it's nothing new. This has been an issue for, I talk to people who've been doing these back in the 80s and 90s. I said communication. And then you tell me today
Decades.
it's
Yep.
communication. What is it? Why haven't we, communication and management, right? Those two
Right.
things. Why is it that we're still continuing to do the same thing instead of making some focus on this?
Oh, I love that question. And I think in part, it's because some of the ways that really as managers we're called upon to communicate to people and as leaders regardless of our position in an organization, so my belief is that we can be a leader in an organization and our job can be to clean the floor, but i
Right.
can i can lead from any position in an organization. It's a decision that we make as a leader. And so as managers, as those who are called upon to manage other people, what makes us great as managers are things that unfortunately take time. So what make us great as, so think about all the great managers that you have had in your life. And I would say it's three key things. One is they put themselves last. So Simon Sinek has a great book called Leaders Eat Last. And really it is about the fact that when you are a world-class manager, your job is to put your team first. Your job is to elevate your team. Your job is to get behind them and push. And so it takes somebody who is willing to, able to, excited to empower their team and isn't looking for the recognition of their leadership as well. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is to manage well takes time. And often managers, they got the reason that they've never been trained is they got to be a manager because they were great in the front line. And so the only way to promote them was to promote them into a position of managing
Mm-hmm.
others. And often they still have a lot of responsibility in the front line because that's where they were really great. And so we've got this organizational model where instead of their job being to manage people well, their job is actually still to produce and also manage people well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very hard thing to do.
Right.
And then the last piece is that there's a countercultural piece of being a world-class leader that has to do with being not only being humble, that first part, getting behind your team and pushing, which is countercultural, but also willing to be vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
willing to tell the truth, even if you are worried that it might make you look bad. So I was running late this morning, and I was running late because I was an idiot. I left the keys to my office in my house. And I was like, 7/8 of the way to my office when I realized that my keys were at my house. And so I was going to be in a difficult situation trying to do a podcast and not being able to get into my office. And rather than saying, I'm with a client and that call is running late, or, coming up with an excuse, I said to you, Elena, I'm running late because I left the keys to my house, to my office in my house. And the better that we can get at telling the truth about like little things like that,
Mhm.
then the better we can get at telling the truth about things that matter.
Mhm.
um one of the things that I do to reach the most people as possible to have the world of work be one in which everyone can thrive is that I'm a what's called a public speaker, which I think is a weird title, but a keynote speaker. I get up on stage and talk to hundreds or thousands of people, and people will often say to me, like, you're good at this, what is it that makes you good at this? And I say, I'm willing to tell the truth
Mhm.
about things that are hard. I get up on a stage in front of thousands of people and say, so I'm a woman who has struggled with my weight my whole life. And what that means for me is that I constantly have a filter that says other people are judging me because of how I look.
Mhm.
And because I have a lot of evidence that that is true. And how it makes me show up isn't great. And so I've had to work on that and let that story go, even though that doesn't mean it's not true, even though somebody might not be looking at me and saying, boy, she needs to eat more salad. Whatever's happening over there in their brain is happening over there.
Mhm.
My opportunity is to show up as authentic and to tell the truth about my life and my experience as a way of helping to support other people, shine a light on other people, and just be authentic. Because when we're being authentic, other people feel it. And so Brene Brown, one of my many mentors and gurus, talks about the fact that the thing that most quickly is going to pull other people in, enroll other people in what you're up to, is our vulnerability. And it's the thing that we least want to show other people,
Mhm.
because we have gotten the message that vulnerability is the same thing as weakness. And it's not. I mean, if you think about it, like, it takes something for me to be able to say, I'm a woman who has struggled with my weight my whole life. If I lived, 200 years ago when it was really great for women to be Rubenesque, then it wouldn't be a problem. But it's a problem today
Mhm.
in the world, in the United States, in the world in which we live. And so I the more that we can tell the truth and be courageous in that and model vulnerability, the more that we can have honest communication. And, there's so many people looking at this from so many different angles. There's a woman named Amy Edmondson who is out of the Harvard Business School, who has popularized the term psychological safety at
Mhm.
work. And a lot of what she's talking about is the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to tell the truth about things. And when we create psychological safety, and this is something that the management in an organization creates. It's got to start at the top. Because if it doesn't, and she's looked at lots of different examples from people on hospital tables dying because the nurse knew that the doctor was doing something that wasn't the right thing to be doing, but there was too much unsafety. Like she couldn't say, or he couldn't say, the nurse couldn't say, excuse me, doc, you're making a mistake, because of the hierarchy, because the doctor would retaliate, So, and, from examples like that to examples like the Challenger shuttle exploding because people at NASA knew that those valves, that those rings were going to fail in cold temperatures. And, spoiler alert, it's cold in space. They knew that those rings were going to fail, but it was not safe enough for them to say, we have a problem here. And people died. And, and I worked in an organization where it was not safe for me to speak up and tell the truth, and nobody died, but it took a huge toll on me and on my self-esteem and on my sense of agency and my sense of my own abilities. And, so whether what we're talking about is literally a life and death issue, or whether we're just what we're talking about is people not feeling able to be authentic at work, and whether it's not feeling like I can be myself because myself is gay or transgender or differently abled or neurodiverse, things that we can work to code switch around, or whether it is that I'm a person of color, or I'm a person from, or I never went to college, but I feel like I can't say that. I have to cover that up. Or, whatever the challenges that we have overcome in our lives are, or really maybe they weren't challenges, but they were things that make us feel like, or that people use to make us feel like the other. When we can't be ourselves at work, we can't do our best work. And, what organizations need their people to do is to do their best work. And when we set up the conditions so that people can't be authentic in whatever way that looks like, when we don't have psychological safety, then it just doesn't go well. And we are not as profitable, and people don't stick around, and all of the things that happen. And so this is an incredibly long answer to your very
No,
well,
it's
not to your
it's
very not simple question about
very
why
valid
have we
points.
been working on this for
Yeah.
decades and not making progress, is because we have set up a system that makes it such that it's very hard to make progress on this, and it's countercultural to make progress on this. And somebody asked me, we were talking about emotional intelligence the other day, and somebody asked me, is emotional intelligence becoming more mainstream because more organizations like the US Navy and the US Air Force and the National Football League are finally realizing that, these very male, obviously, these very male institutions are realizing that emotional intelligence has a real part in their effectiveness. And so, now, like, essentially what she was saying is, like, now that men are on board, is it becoming more mainstream? And my answer was, unfortunately, I don't know,
Probably, yeah.
but probably yes. Probably yes. And that sucks, that feels wrong and awful. And, like, well, this is the world that we live in. And if what it has taken for this to become mainstream is men suddenly realizing, like, oh, wait, these quote unquote soft skills, and I hate that term because it's just like emotional intelligence. It puts it in a box that makes it feel easy to negate it. Like, well,
Mm-hmm.
those are
Soft
soft
skill, yeah.
skills. That's emotional intelligence.
Mm.
You know, like that just doesn't matter. The hard skills, the technical skills, that's really what matters here. And it's in line with this stupid idea that we used to have, which was that emotions had no place in the workplace. It's how we got to this idea that, you know, I was one Janine when I came to work, and I was a different Janine when I went home. And of course, that's nonsense. And people did live their lives that way. They were one
Mm-hmm.
version of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of what we've realized is that when we let the whole human come to work, when we invite the whole human, not even not let, that's not the right word, but you know, even me who does this work all the time, my brain occasionally still gets stuck in that old paradigm. When we let, when we allow, no, when we
No.
invite, when we intentionally create the spaces where people are encouraged to be their whole selves,
Right.
the workplace is enlivened, people stick around, they do better work, we get better customer engagement, we get better employee engagement, productivity goes up, profitability goes up, like all of the things that
Mm-hmm.
that make work great get created in those circumstances.
Mm. You mentioned so many great things. It was like I mean, you've covered everything. I think I wanted to even talk plus, but what I think is astonishing is that you're right. Part of it is also because leadership is tend to be this like we have to be harsh and we have to be leaders and etc. And I don't know where it's coming from, maybe from wartime or maybe from I don't
Yeah,
know where, right? Like that's where we had those initial leaders, right? Or like politics and war. But in organization, this notion of leadership is very different. And the more human you are, the better you're able to manage your people because it's all about connecting with others. And I
right.
think that one of the things that maybe companies see a shift in and started to listen, part of it is yes, because it's become this mainstream and men in particular, like, oh, maybe there's something to it. But also part of it is generations coming in are
Absolutely.
requiring something very different, and companies have to listen because this is their future talent and current talent pipeline. And a lot of young people coming into these organizations are saying, this isn't, I do not want to be managed this way, this is not a sticks approach over here. And they're just not they're not putting up with it, so they're forcing that change as well. So I find that very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and so when I opened my business, which was just 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago, um, at that point, people were still saying, like, oh my God, what do I do about these millennials? They are such a
Mhm.
problem. Well, now, fast forward 5.5 years, the oldest millennial is now 41 years old.
Mhm.
And in 5 years, the millennials and the Gen Zs who were coming up after them will be 75% of our workforce. And so I was talking with a group of CEOs the other day, and I was talking about how the in this time of the great resignation, the great reshuffling, the great reorganization, whatever you want to call it, and the reason that these titles are being thrown around is because it used to be that people were leaving organizations for 20 years. People were leaving organizations at about the rate of 2.5 million people per month. And this is people who are not being laid off, not being fired, but choosing to leave. Sometimes choosing to leave for another job. Sometimes, you know, all people have all kinds of reasons for voluntarily leaving a job. So we had been at 2.5 million people per month for 20 years within that range. Sometimes it was low as 1.5, sometimes it was as high as, you know, 3, but essentially it was on average 2.5 million. We are
Mhm.
now at a sustained rate of 4.5 million people, and we've been there since last November.
Wow.
And so it's almost double, from 2.5 million to 4.5 million people every month voluntarily leaving their jobs.
Mm.
And so what you're pointing, and so I was talking about this and the fact that the number one reason that people are leaving their jobs is what is being put in a clump, and this was from a study by MIT. Number one reason is toxic organizations. And when you get into the data and sort of peel that apart, the number one reason inside of that is organizations not doing anything meaningful or anything substantive enough around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Next reason is feeling disrespected at work. The next reason is not being managed well.
Mm.
And so the three things that we're talking about here, those are the reasons that people are leaving. And when I was talking with this group of CEOs, their response was, yeah, but were most of those people millennials? And I said, well, probably more of those people were millennials than of any other generation because of these statistics. And
Right.
in 2.5 years, they're going to be 75% of our workforce, the millennials and the Gen Zs. And so, yeah, they were overrepresented. And if you haven't gotten on board yet with the things that matter to these generations, now is the time, because
Mhm.
people are not willing to put up with the things that I was willing to put up with. And in some ways it makes sense. Like, my parents lived through the Great Depression. And so, well, they were sort of born at the end of the Great Depression, but their parents lived through the Great Depression, and it was very much still part of the mentality. So when I was growing up in the world of work, the attitude was, be thankful that you have a paycheck.
Mhm.
And so I was willing to sort of put up with whatever I needed to put up with because I needed a paycheck. These generations were not raised in that same way. And so they don't have the same sort of fear of scarcity. They have the belief, because they have the experience, like, well, I can create a side hustle. I can figure out how to pull together enough money for rent. And so I have, food on the table. And so I'll figure it out, but I'm not willing to pay the price that this organization is demanding me to pay in terms of how I'm treated, or not being able to be myself, or not really feeling like I belong. And they will leave.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, leadership just really has to find a way to talk to these generations in a way that's attractive for them to stay, because you're right, they will leave, and they're leaving because they're not getting that. But there are also a lot of them that are staying at companies that do it well, that are paying
Right.
attention, that are having these conversations, that are creating the work environments where they can, feel comfortable and kind of thrive and see themselves long term. There are still very many millennials and even Gen Zs that are looking for some stability, especially, those with young families. They're looking for
Right.
that stability. So I think it's not fair to kind of, to their point, to kind of just talk about because they're millennials. Like it's just what it is, and you have to address that. So it's a great point.
And I was talking with a group of millennials the other day, and I said, my experience, I love millennials, and I love what they are about, as and within any generation, of course, there are, because we're talking about millions and millions and millions of people. So of
Mhm.
course there are people who fit the stereotype of that generation, and there's people who don't. And what this generation cares about is um fairness. It's why they are so social justice minded. What they care about is honesty. What they care about is authenticity. What they care about is belonging. And when they find those leaders and those people and those organizations, they will be incredibly loyal.
Yes.
And so, in part, I was talking with another client about how, really, when we can help people understand, okay, so my job is, or the company that I'm working for makes shoes. And the way that we see our shoes as making the world a better place
Mm,
is fill in the blank. Like our mission beyond just making shoes is this, and our vision for the world is this, and our values look like this. And so then when, if your job is to clean the floor, or if your job is to, push a button that puts the sole on the shoes, or your job is to be selling those shoes, or, whatever your job is in that company, you can see how your values connect to their values.
mhm,
And so when we as companies can get clear on what really is our mission. I was talking the other day with the founder of blinds.com, and the biggest blind, shades, biggest
mhm,
blind company in the world. His mission for his organization after he went through a transformation was for his people to be the best version of themselves that they could be.
mm,
Nothing to do with blinds, nothing to
yeah.
be the number one blind maker in the world. No, his mission was to have his people be the best version of themselves that they could be. And so when we can get beyond what it is that we do to what we actually care about as an organization. And if we don't know what that is, get with get with somebody like me and the millions of other people who are like me who help organizations do
Mm,
this, to figure that out, because that's actually a key thing that's going to keep your millennials not only with you but engaged,
mhm.
and turn them into high performers where they can't wait to get up in the morning and come to work with you.
I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. I think it's a great message. And on that point, if people do want to get in touch with you or kind of check out your podcast, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today, and I know we both have to be elsewhere in just a moment, but where can people find you? Where can they get in touch with you? So just to continue the conversation, and I would love to continue this at a different time as well sometime. Would love, I think there's just so many interesting points you brought up that we can just have those discussions
I,
on
I
and
would
on.
I would
So,
love that. Yeah.
but where do you hang
So
out? And LinkedIn, maybe?
where do I hang out?
Yeah, social
I
media.
hang
What?
out I hang out many different places. So the easiest place to find me is LinkedIn. I'm the only Janine Hamner Holman there.
Mhm.
You can also find me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. You can email me, which I imagine will be in the show notes, but it's
Yeah.
Janine at J&J, which is my company, the J&J Consulting Group. So I would love it if people want to connect. And again, the podcast is called The Cost of Not Paying Attention. And we look at all the places that we're not paying attention to, usually in the world of work, but not exclusively. I'm going to talk with an artist soon. So I'm really excited about that. So yeah, I would love to connect with your listeners.
That's awesome. Well, Janine, thank you again for making the time, for sharing a lot of really great kind of practical things that leaders can consider and just think about and apply. So very much appreciate your time, and let's do this again.
Elena, it's been my honor.